Hey there, neighbors. Just a quick request before we jump into the episode. I've been posting a lot more short form content on places like Instagram and TikTok, and then reposting that stuff to places like Threads and X and Facebook. So if you would, go to the podcast website, www.neighborontheleft.com, and in the contact section, all the social media links are there. Stop on over and check out some of the short form content. It tends to be a bit more lighthearted, at least some of it, more comedic than the heavy podcast episodes. But I would love to have you stop by, and if you'd be so kind to like and follow what you see. Thank you very much. And on to the episode. I'm sure that we're all grateful to hear that there is a massive crackdown coming. Fraud, corruption, abuse, waste. The Trump administration says it's going to get all of it. J.D. Vance is out there warning officials in blue states that prison cells may be waiting. Conservative media is acting like Elliot Ness just kicked in the door with a stack of subpoenas and an eagle screeching somewhere in the background. And look, fraud is real. People steal. The older I get, the more convinced I am that people suck. Contractors cheat. Corporations cook numbers. Government money gets abused. That happens everywhere that humans exist. But here's the thing. Listening to this administration talk about fraud is a little like watching a smoke detector that only goes off when Democrats light a cigarette. Because somehow the outrage always points in one direction. If a struggling family gets too much assistance, it's a national talking point. If a city government in a blue state, screws something up, civilizational collapse is on the horizon. But when politically connected people get sweetheart treatment, when massive white-collar fraudsters get mercy, when no-bid contracts start floating around Washington like cocktail napkins at a Mar-a-Lago fundraiser, when presidential financial disclosures raise ethics questions that would have caused, congressional hearings at the very least 10 years ago, suddenly everybody gets real quiet. And that silence is interesting to me. No, seriously. Think about it, because what I want to talk about here is not about pretending that fraud doesn't exist. It's about asking why some fraud gets turned into, a moral apocalypse while other fraud barely causes a shrug. It's about selective outrage, or selective morality, or selective accountability. And somewhere along the way, anti-corruption stopped meaning against corruption. Now it mostly means against corruption committed by the other side. And that's where I think things get dangerous. Hello, neighbors. Happy Wednesday, and welcome to Your Neighbor on the Left, podcast where we talk about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, and I am your host. And today we are talking about fraud. It's a big word these days, and it's getting a lot of mileage in Washington, D.C., at least from the administration and people like J.D. Vance. But I want to talk about not whether fraud exists, because it does. Obviously, it does. Everyone knows it does. I want to talk about how we identify it and what the reactions are to it, and why they may not be as transparent as one would like. So let's establish something right out of the gate before anybody starts throwing around the usual nonsense. As I said, fraud exists. It exists in red states. It exists in blue states. It exists in cities, in rural towns. It exists in corporations, nonprofits, churches, government agencies, private industry, hospitals, defense contractors, and yes, in welfare systems too. Humans steal money. Humans manipulate systems. Humans cut corners. Humans rationalize their unethical behavior. That is not a partisan observation. That's anthropology with an internet connection. And honestly, if the Trump administration had approached this as a broad conversation about institutional corruption in America, I wouldn't even be doing this episode, because there actually is a conversation worth having here. There's Medicare fraud, there's insurance fraud, there's corporate accounting fraud, contractor fraud, tax fraud, procurement fraud, banking fraud, PPP loan fraud, wage theft, especially wage theft. And this is where things start to get interesting, because wage theft is one of those phrases that conservatives tend to roll their eyes at when you say it like somebody just, started reading poetry at a city council meeting. But wage theft is very, very real. And no, it's not some activist slogan somebody made up, in a sociology department. It's an actual legal issue. Wage theft is when employers illegally withhold money workers have already earned. Now, that can mean refusing to pay overtime, making employees work off the clock, altering time cards, withholding final paychecks, making tipped workers do unpaid labor, or classifying workers as independent contractors so companies can dodge benefits and labor protections. And I know that people will say, well, businesses have it hard too. Yeah, sure, some do. But if your business model depends on illegally underpaying workers, congratulations. Your business model is theft with a payroll department. And here's the part that should completely change how Americans think about this issue. Economic researchers have estimated that wage theft costs American workers more money than robbery, burglary, and motor vehicle theft combined. Think about that for a moment. The average American has probably spent more time hearing politicians rage about somebody improperly receiving food assistance than hearing about employers illegally stealing wages from workers. In fact, I'd venture to bet that some of you may never have even heard the term wage theft. And that's not accidental. That imbalance tells you something. Because culturally, Americans have been trained to picture the thief in a very specific way. Usually poor, usually struggling, usually somebody receiving government assistance, usually somebody politicians can point at while they're standing in front of a flag and talking about hard-working taxpayers. But a corporation shaving overtime pay off of hundreds of workers, somehow that's treated as an HR issue. A worker stealing $50 from a register, of course, is a criminal. A company stealing thousands from their employees is a compliance violation. Apparently, theft only counts when the person doing it can't afford a yacht. And this is why I get skeptical when politicians suddenly start screaming about fraud like they just discovered corruption existed. Because corruption in America has never been treated equally. Not culturally, not politically, not economically. The outrage itself gets distributed very much unevenly. And once you notice that, it's hard to unsee it. Because if this administration truly wanted to wage war on fraud consistently, there are gigantic targets everywhere. Wall Street settlements alone could fill a Netflix documentary library. Major corporations get caught manipulating markets and violating labor laws, engaging in deceptive practices, poisoning communities, exploiting workers, and then paying fines that amount to, the financial equivalent of a billionaire checking between his couch cushions. Meanwhile, somebody accidentally misreporting income on a benefits form gets talked about like they personally kicked down the doors of Fort Knox. And that disconnect matters, not just morally, politically. Because the story a country tells about who steals eventually becomes the story it tells about who deserves punishment. And that leads directly into the next part of this whole thing, because the modern obsession with welfare fraud didn't just appear out of thin air. It was built carefully over decades. And here is the thing about welfare fraud rhetoric. On the surface, it sounds infinitely reasonable. Nobody wants public money wasted. Nobody wants scams. Nobody wants programs abused. I don't think that is controversial. If somebody is intentionally gaming a system designed to help vulnerable people, most Americans would agree that's wrong. But that's the surface level. Underneath that, there's another layer entirely, because American politics has made, welfare fraud, it's never just been about accounting. It's cultural and emotional and symbolic. For decades now, conservative politics has trained people to associate poverty with moral failure. Not bad luck, not structural problems, not, wages stagnating while costs explode, not medical debt, not layoffs, not housing crises. No, the story became people are poor because they are irresponsible and lazy, dependent, undisciplined, everybody's looking for a handout. And once you build that narrative deeply enough, and seed it into the country, the culture, stories about welfare fraud stop sounding like isolated crimes, and they become confirmation. Confirmation that those people are actually who conservatives always claim they were. That's why these stories generate so much emotional heat. I mean, think about how welfare fraud stories are usually presented in partisan media. They're almost never framed like clinically. It's not, here's a policy oversight issue requiring administrative reform. That's not how they're presented. They're always emotionally loaded. Your hard-earned money, freeloaders, cheats. These people are living better than you. People abusing the system while you have to go to work. And that framing is intentional, and it matters, because the goal isn't just informing people that fraud exists. The goal is creating resentment, because resentment is politically useful, especially when you're trying to build support for cutting social programs. Because if voters believe welfare systems are overflowing with scammers, then reducing assistance starts feeling less cruel. That's the trick. That's the pivot right there. You stop talking about hunger and you start talking about abuse. You stop talking about struggling families and you change the subject to cheaters. You don't talk about whether children should be eating. You talk about protecting the taxpayers. And once that emotional transition happens, cutting aid is much easier politically. Think about how often you hear the phrase, "We need to make sure benefits go to the people who really need them." Now, that's one of those things that on paper sounds fine. But in practice, what often follows is more paperwork and more restrictions and more hoops, suspicion, people denied assistance, more people falling through the cracks, more families, surrendering because the system becomes impossible to navigate. And all of it gets justified by constantly invoking fraud. If you convince people the system is crawling with fraudsters, then cutting assistance stops looking mean and starts looking responsible. That's the mechanism. And notice something else. The political obsession is rarely proportional to the actual scale of the problem that they're discussing. I think that's very important because politicians and media outlets will spend weeks screaming about isolated welfare fraud cases involving amounts of money that, that corporations literally lose in their, office furniture budgets. Meanwhile, wage theft costs workers tens of billions of dollars every single year. Corporate fraud drains staggering amounts from the economy. Major financial crimes reshape entire industries. But those stories rarely receive the same moral panic treatment that welfare fraud does. Why? Because one kind of fraud reinforces an ideological narrative, and the other kind of complicates it. One story says the poor are abusing the system, and the other story says the powerful are abusing the system. And from a political perspective, those stories lead to very different conclusions. One conclusion leads to cuts in social programs. The other conclusion leads to very uncomfortable conversations about wealth and power and labor protections and regulations and corporate accountability, economic inequality. Guess which conversation modern conservative politics prefers? And look, before anybody sends me a message saying, liberals can be hypocrites too, of course they can. Every political movement contains hypocrisy. Every ideology has blind spots. Every partisan ecosystem, selectively amplifies certain things. But what we're talking about now feels different in scale. Because we're reaching a point where corruption itself is no longer being evaluated consistently. It's, like so many other things, has become tribal. Now the first question isn't what happened. The first question is who did it? And once that becomes the standard, everything changes because suddenly ethics becomes conditional, morality becomes situational, and corruption becomes something you only recognize when your opponents are involved. And that brings us to one of the strangest parts of this whole supposed anti-fraud crusade, and that's the people who are getting mercy. So while conservative media is out there describing welfare fraud like it's, the asteroid from Deep Impact heading towards Earth, something else has been happening a bit more quietly. Depending on how much time you spend immersed in news. Trump has granted clemency to people involved in massive financial fraud. And one of the clearest examples is Lawrence Duran. Now, if you haven't heard that name before, that's kind of part of the story. Because this didn't dominate cable news for 3 straight weeks. There weren't nightly countdown clocks. There weren't, breathless monologues about the collapse of civilization. And nobody that I saw on conservative TikTok was filming themselves in their Oakleys from the front seat of a pickup screaming about how America was dying because of this. It was mostly just silence. We're close to it. Duran was convicted in connection with a massive Medicare fraud scheme involving hundreds of millions of dollars. Millions. Not somebody fudging paperwork to get extra grocery benefits, not a single mom accidentally misreporting income during a chaotic year, not, somebody selling loose cigarettes on a street corner, a massive healthcare fraud case. And remember, Medicare is one of those programs conservatives consistently tell us is sacred because seniors depend on it. I mean, you hear that all the time. We have to protect Medicare. Our seniors earned it. Government waste is threatening these vital programs. Yeah, okay. So if that's true, if fraud involving taxpayer-funded healthcare is this, existential moral catastrophe, why exactly are people involved in gigantic Medicare fraud schemes receiving clemency? And, to be very clear here, I cannot tell you there's proven evidence of some secret personal relationship between Trump and Lawrence Duran. I can't confirm that. And I'm not going to invent conspiracies because the facts themselves are already troubling enough. Honestly, part of the problem is that the public still doesn't really know what the reasoning was behind why certain people receive clemency while others don't. The process is, very often opaque, selective, and, just quiet. And that matters because presidential clemency is supposed to be extraordinary. It's supposed to represent justice and mercy and rehabilitation or unfair sentencing concerns, things like that. But increasingly, especially in Trump 2.0, it often feels like a strange VIP lounge for politically adjacent or well-connected white-collar defendants. And that perception becomes hard to ignore when you compare the rhetoric, because think about the emotional language that we've been talking about. We call, the welfare fraudsters parasites and freeloaders and leeches on society. Now compare that to the language often used for wealthy financial criminals. Maybe the sentence was too harsh. They made mistakes. They're good businessmen. They've suffered enough. It's amazing how much more compassionate America becomes when defending someone in cufflinks. And this isn't just about one guy, although I should also mention that along with his clemency, he was relieved of having to pay the $87 million in restitution that was ordered through his conviction. But anyway, yes, this isn't just about one guy. This is part of a broader pattern where elite financial misconduct often gets softened. White-collar criminals are frequently treated as, flawed professionals who got a little too ambitious. While poor people accused of fraud, they're treated like, a moral contagion. Same country, just different moral framework. And here's where the contradiction really starts to scream. The same political movement that says fraud is destroying America, the same movement using fraud rhetoric to justify cuts to social programs and, telling struggling Americans they need more scrutiny, more restrictions, more verification, more hoops, somehow found mercy for people involved in enormous financial fraud schemes. Now, I'm not the only one getting that message, right? If you're poor, the system assumes you're lying. And if you're wealthy, the system starts asking whether maybe everybody's been too hard on you. That's not equal accountability. That's class-based morality wearing anti-corruption costume. And once you start noticing it, you begin seeing this weird pattern everywhere, especially in government contracting, especially in procurement, especially in, that kind of I know a guy politics that America claims to hate right up until the right people start using it. Which brings us to the reflecting pool. And honestly, if this story had happened under Obama, conservative media would still be building documentaries about it, narrated by a guy with the voice of an angry smoke detector. Okay, but enough about that fantasy. Let's talk about the actual reflecting pool, because this story it sounds about as fake as a real story could possibly sound. Not fake as in it didn't happen, but fake as in how did this not become a satire sketch with Alec Baldwin and a sad trumpet soundtrack? The Trump administration approved a no-bid contract connected to renovations at the Lincoln Memorial Reflecting Pool. And before we even get into the politics of it, let's explain what a no-bid contract actually means, because most people hear that phrase and their eyes glaze over like, somebody just started explaining, printer warranties or something. Normally, government contracts are supposed to go through a competitive bidding process, and the idea is pretty simple. Multiple companies compete for the job. You compare qualifications, you compare pricing, you create transparency, you reduce favoritism, you lower the odds of corruption. You make it harder for public officials to hand taxpayer money to their buddies like, they're picking fantasy football teams. That is the point of the bid process. Now, there are situations where government can bypass that process. Emergencies, natural disasters, national security situations, critical infrastructure failures. There are moments where wading through months of procurement bureaucracy would genuinely create harm. That's what no-bid emergency authority is generally supposed to be for. Most people hear emergency government contract and think, things like hurricanes, bridge collapses, wildfires, terror threats. They don't think of decorative pool renovations. And I'd say this is where things get weird, but let's not pretend they're not weird already. Because Trump publicly said on camera that he knew a guy for this project. He knew a guy who was great with swimming pools. Now, maybe that phrase was casual, maybe he was joking, but when you're simultaneously branding yourself as the fearless warrior against corruption and fraud, saying, I know a guy, while taxpayer-funded no-bid contracts are floating around, is not exactly ideal optics. And that's putting it mildly. That's like running an anti-arson campaign while holding a flamethrower and smelling vaguely like gas. And again, I want to be careful here because this matters. I am not alleging proven criminal conduct. That is important. What I am saying is that this administration has created a political climate where ordinary people are constantly being told fraud is everywhere, government corruption is rampant, taxpayer money is under attack. Okay, then shouldn't the standards apply consistently? Shouldn't people who claim to care deeply about corruption also care about favoritism concerns, transparency concerns, the appearance of insider relationships? Or does that concern only activate under very specific political conditions? The same online personalities who can detect suspicious spending in Minneapolis from 12 states away suddenly become unbelievably relaxed about this particular story. No outrage videos, no furious threads, no 10-minute rants filmed, on an iPhone. Just vibes, silence, shrugs. And honestly, that's the part I keep coming back to, the inconsistency. Because if you genuinely believe corruption is poisoning America, you should care about systems that reduce favoritism. That's not a stretch. That seems logical. You should care about competitive bidding. You should care about transparency. You should especially care when political leaders publicly reference personal familiarity with a contractor who gets involved in taxpayer-funded projects. That should bother you regardless of whether you're left or right. But instead, what we keep seeing is this bizarre transformation where anti-corruption politics suddenly becomes incredibly flexible once the corruption-adjacent behavior comes from inside the tribe. And that flexibility shows up everywhere now. Not just contracts, but financial disclosures as well. And this next part is where people start getting very defensive very quickly. Now, I'm going to start this segment off carefully because nuance still matters, even though social media has apparently declared war on it. I am not saying that there is irrefutable evidence that Donald Trump is guilty of criminal insider trading. There. Now, I realize a lot of listeners may take that as pussyfooting around, But I'm sticking to the facts on this point as they are known right now. I believe that's important, that it matters, that, facts matter. But what I am saying is that recent financial disclosures and reporting surrounding Trump's trading activity has raised serious ethical concerns and questions about appearances of conflict. And once again, it's the reaction gap that I find fascinating because, think about the world conservatives have described to us now for the past, several years. According to this worldview, corruption is everywhere. Government insiders are enriching themselves. Political elites are gaming the system. Ordinary Americans are getting screwed while powerful people cash in behind closed doors. Yeah. Then surely people who believe that, people who spend all day talking about the swamp, would be deeply interested in presidential financial activity that appears unusually well positioned around policy influence and market moving agents. Right? You'd think that would trigger at least some curiosity, no? But instead, the reaction is mostly, And that's freaking weird. That is profoundly weird. Especially because ethics rules around financial conflicts exist. And they exist for a reason, not just to prevent actual corruption, but to preserve the public trust. And that's a distinction that matters because sometimes the issue isn't proving criminality in a courtroom. Sometimes the issue needs to be, should people in positions of enormous government power be engaging in behavior that creates obvious appearances of conflict? I think that's a valid concern. Or at least it used to be. There was a time in American politics when even the mere appearance of impropriety could become a major scandal. Now, we've become so numb that people practically need a senator to ride into Congress on a flaming ATV carrying a duffel bag full of cash before anybody notices something might be ethically questionable. And here's where the double standard becomes virtually impossible to ignore. A struggling family receiving too much SNAP assistance gets treated by the conservative media like the opening scene of, a dystopian movie. But presidentially adjacent financial activity that raises major ethics concerns, that's totally fine. Nothing to see here. Just move along, citizen. And no, seriously, think about how dramatic the imbalance has become. People online will spend 6 hours dissecting whether somebody improperly qualified for benefits or, whether a daycare in Minnesota had registered fictitious clients, but at the same time showing almost zero curiosity about people operating near the highest levels of political power and making extraordinarily well-timed financial moves. I mean, how does that asymmetry not set off alarm bells for you? Anti-corruption movements that are genuine tend to apply scrutiny broadly. They don't say accountability for them and grace for us, but increasingly that's exactly what modern partisan politics has grown to look like. And again, this isn't unique to conservatives in every historical sense. Partisanship has always existed and hypocrisy has always existed. But Trump-era politics has taken this to a whole other level because the inconsistency itself has become normalized. Openly normalized. People don't even pretend standards are universal anymore. Now it's just, did my side benefit? That is the test. One question, end of story. That's the entire moral framework. And once a political movement reaches that point, once consistency dies completely, you no longer have anything that actually resembles anti-corruption politics. What you have is fandom, or dare I say, cult-like behavior. Which brings us to the part of this whole thing that honestly fascinates me the most. And it's not Trump, and it's not the contracts, not even the pardons. It's the outrage machine itself. Because the reactions, the reaction patterns tell the real story. All right, now, before I get into this part, again, let me acknowledge something up front, because I can already see the comments and the emails from, someone in all caps with the name Patriot 1776 Actual as their username. Yes, partisan hypocrisy exists across politics. Liberals can absolutely be selective. Democrats can absolutely minimize scandals involving people that they like. Cable news in general has the emotional maturity of a raccoon trapped in a Red Bull warehouse. Fine, I agree. But what's happened in Trump-era politics feels different in scale and intensity. Because we are watching the collapse of consistent standards in real time. And honestly, I think social media accelerated this dramatically. Because modern political identity isn't just about beliefs anymore. It's a lifestyle now. Community and entertainment and personal identity. For some people, it's basically like a sports franchise, with, I don't know, apocalyptic branding, I guess. And now that politics has become identity for so many people, any criticism is now felt personally. Because now the goal is no longer apply the standard consistently. Now the goal is protect the tribe. And once that happens, corruption itself starts getting filtered through that loyalty. Not necessarily evidence or ethics or principles, but loyalty. So here's what you end up with. When it's Minnesota, it's outrage. When it's welfare, it's outrage. If it's immigrants, outrage. Food assistance, outrage. When a Democratic mayor, sneezes near a spreadsheet, 3-hour live streams on TikTok titled, "They're Stealing Your Future." But no bid contracts connected to political favoritism, silence. Massive fraud pardons, silence. Ethics concerns surrounding presidential financial activity, silence. Actually, not just silence, defensiveness. Instant defensiveness. And that just fascinates me, because if somebody genuinely cared about corruption consistently, these stories would at the very least, trigger some curiosity. At minimum. I mean, you'd expect hold on, wait a second, let's look into this. But instead, what often happens is immediate rationalization. Well, that's different. Or he probably had a reason. Or he's just a smart businessman and you don't understand what he's doing. You're overreacting. What about Biden? The media lies. Pick your retort of choice. And look, sometimes the media does get things wrong, and more than sometimes, a lot of the time. Sometimes outrage is exaggerated. But that's not what's happening here. What's happening is selective moral activation. People who describe corruption as the defining issue of our time suddenly become unbelievably calm once the questionable behavior comes from their own political side. And this is where, that fandom problem comes in, because fandom changes how people process information. If you're a sports fan and your quarterback commits a penalty, you're more likely to explain it away. You blame the refs. You say the other team does worse. You defend the jersey. That mentality is annoying as hell in football. In government, it's absolutely enraging. It's dangerous because governments actually control money and power and courts and military force and, people's lives. And democracies only function if citizens are willing to apply standards to their own side too. That's the part that keeps democracy from turning into tribal warfare with paperwork. And right now, a huge chunk of our political culture seems completely unwilling to do that. Well, I don't know, not just unwilling, I guess. They're actually offended by the suggestion. That's why the anti-corruption branding feels so ridiculous to a lot of people. Because if corruption only matters when Democrats do it, then, corruption really isn't the issue. Power is the issue, and punishment is the issue. Narrative control. Think about how many online personalities built entire brands around being anti-establishment truth tellers. They were supposedly exposing corruption, pulling back the curtain, holding the powerful accountable. And now many of them function more like public relations departments. And the pattern is so predictable, it's almost mechanical. If the story hurts the left, it's moral outrage. If the story hurts Trump, oh, well, we need context. There's excuses, deflections, whataboutism, or, complete disinterest. That's not critical thinking. That's branding. And honestly, one of the biggest problems with this dynamic is what it does to ordinary people trying to figure out what the hell is actually true. Because eventually, citizens stop believing standards exist at all. Everybody assumes every investigation is political, every accusation is partisan, every ethics concern is just tribal warfare. And when you reach that level of cynicism, it then becomes much easier for real corruption to take place. Because people become too exhausted and too polarized to evaluate anything consistently. Everything just becomes, okay, which team are you on? And meanwhile, the people with the actual power keep operating comfortably inside of that chaos. That's the trick. That's the game right there. Keep the public emotionally locked into partisan outrage cycles. And meanwhile, standards quietly become optional for the powerful. And honestly, I think this is where the whole fraud conversation wanders into the truly dangerous territory. Not because fraud investigations themselves are bad. Fraud should be investigated. Corruption should matter. Public money should be protected. But if accountability becomes selectively applied, if anti-corruption talk becomes just another weapon in the partisan fight, if we can only recognize unethical behavior when it's committed by a political enemy, then eventually the entire concept of accountability means nothing. And without that, you don't get cleaner government that way. You get tribes protecting their own corruption while screaming about everybody else's, which is, pretty much the opposite of what anti-corruption politics are supposed to be. The older I get, the more I think one of the biggest problems in America and American politics is that we've completely confused consistency with disloyalty. If you criticize your own side now, people look at you like you just keyed the family car. And what could be more dangerous? Because democracy actually depends on people being willing to say, yeah, you know what, that's wrong, no matter who's doing it. That's supposed to be the safeguard. That's supposed to be the thing that keeps movements from drifting into cult behavior and moral rot. But what we're seeing now, especially in Trump-era politics, is this strange transformation where anti-corruption rhetoric has become almost entirely aesthetic. It's just branding. It's performance. It's not so much corruption is bad as it is corruption committed by our enemies is bad. It's very, very different. And once you notice it, you're going to notice it in lots of places. The poor family getting extra benefits by mistake is a national outrage. The wage theft draining billions from workers, much, much smaller of a story. Blue state fraud allegations get endless coverage. Massive white-collar fraudsters getting clemency, a 30-second blurb. Government waste involving political enemies is a moral collapse. No bid contracts and I know a guy stuff. Suddenly everybody discovers nuance and patience. And again, I'm going to stress this one last time. Somebody's out there typing, so you're saying Democrats are perfect? Absolutely, positively not. Corruption exists everywhere power exists. Fraud should matter in red states. It should matter in blue states. It should matter in corporations. It should matter in welfare systems, in boardrooms, in government contracting, in the White House. That's the point. The standards are supposed to apply across the board, and if they don't, if accountability only activates when it's politically convenient, then anti-corruption politics isn't about ethics. It's just nonsense with a donkey or an elephant on the spreadsheets. And honestly, I think a lot of people feel this inconsistency, even if they don't always articulate it. People sense when outrage is performative. They sense when politicians are using terms like fraud less as a genuine concern and more as a soundbite or branding strategy, especially when the targets are almost always the same. Poor people, immigrants, blue cities, Democrats, public assistance programs. Meanwhile, financial elites and politically connected insiders keep getting treated with a level of patience and forgiveness that is astounding when, and not what ordinary people normally experience. That imbalance changes society over time because eventually people stop believing that there's any accountability anywhere. They stop believing that ethics have meaning, and they stop believing that rules are real. They start believing everything is just power protecting itself. And once we reach that level of cynicism, corruption does not shrink. It just metastasizes. Because nobody trusts the referees anymore. Nobody trusts the institutions or the investigations or the oversight. Everything just becomes, whose side are you on? And, if that's the dominant political instinct, then the people with the actual power win every single time. Because divided, cynical, exhausted populations are easier to manipulate than populations operating from shared standards. So yeah, investigate fraud and investigate corruption and investigate waste. Abso-freaking-lutely. But investigate all of the fraud and the corruption and the waste. Not just the kind that polls well on conservative talk radio, not just the kind that generates angry Facebook comments, not just the kind committed by people who don't have money and status or political connections. Fraud should matter whether the person committing it wears a hoodie, a business suit, or a red campaign hat. And if corruption only matters when the other tribe does it, then corruption was never really the issue in the first place. All right, everybody, thank you so much for taking the time to download and listen to this episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. I'm thrilled that you did, and I would love to hear from you. I want to hear your thoughts on this topic. I want to hear what you think. Is there a double standard? Am I off base? Am I right on target? Go to the website, neighborontheleft.com, go to the contacts page, and either, send me a message on social media or use the email address to send me a message and let me know what you think about this and about anything else. Critiques, compliments, suggestions, whatever. While you're on the website, you can also check out the episodes page where you can download or stream any episode of the podcast going all the way back to episode 1. And if you go to the blog section, you'll see the posts I make that match the topics I talk about here on the podcast, and I include the links of all the sources that I use for my information. We'll be back on Friday with an installment of Back Porch Files. So between now and then, Stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.